Привет с Украины. Hello from Ukraine. I arrived here last night. Took about 20 hours of flying and airport waiting, but I had a good time. Went through London and Germany. So I'll be here till Thursday, wee hours of the morning Thursday. I'll start to fly back. I'm going to preach at my friend Mohammed's church, the church he started here. And then I think on Tuesday, I'm going to be shooting a series of videos for Iranians. So I'm probably going to use some of the material that I'm going to be teaching y'all this morning is the stuff that I'm going to be teaching for the Iranians as well, because the thing that my friend Mohammed asked me to do was to get some lessons together for persecuted Christians. And a lot of the Christians that he ministers to are in Iran and Afghanistan, and they're in underground churches. Or if they're outside of Iran and Afghanistan, they're often refugees who fled. So anyway, we're also talking about some ministry opportunities in the future with Iranians. So I might be presenting some of that to y'all in the near future as well. Anyway, we're going to be doing Jeremiah. We're going to hop around a little bit today. We're going to start with Jeremiah 1 and then move to some parts of Jeremiah, and then come back to Jeremiah 1 at the end. And we're going to talk about Jeremiah's call, or at least part of Jeremiah's call. What I might do too is I might break up this video into short segments. That way we don't have a problem uploading the different videos. But anyway, just let you know. So I've got a PowerPoint just like usual. I've sent that out already. I'm going to start working through it, and I'll call the PowerPoint the numbers of the slides as I go through. That way you guys can follow me. Whoever's there can kind of click on it and take you through. So this is lesson 4 on Jeremiah. And we're talking about Jeremiah as a persecuted prophet. And it's interesting because, and I hadn't really fully, I don't think, taken account of this as I've studied Jeremiah before, but how much Jeremiah is put forth as a paradigm of a persecuted prophet and as a suffering prophet in the Old Testament. There aren't that many prophets we know, or even people we know in the Old Testament who were imprisoned. Joseph is one prime example. But we don't have that many. I think we have Micaiah, who was a prophet under Ahab, and I think he's brought out of a prison to prophesy. And other than that, I can't think of another prophet that's locked up. We do have prophets occasionally that are killed, but that's also a relatively rare thing. It's not until we get to the New Testament, when we look at Jesus and especially Paul and the disciples as they're scattered abroad, the apostles, that we start to see this full-scale persecution like we see in the book of Acts. But Jeremiah is definitely a precursor to Paul in that respect. And I'm starting to wonder the extent to which Paul saw himself as another Jeremiah, or maybe the way Luke writes about Paul, if it can kind of be a parallel to what we see in the prophet Jeremiah. So anyway, before we go into that, let's start with the call of Jeremiah. Now, in slide number 2, we know that the prophecy of Jeremiah comes to him during the reign of Josiah. So we've seen this slide before. So it talks about how the words of Jeremiah come to him. He's from Benjamin. That the word of the Lord came to him in the days of Josiah, and then in the 13th year of his reign, which was before the reform started. But then the word of the Lord kept coming to Jeremiah to his own personal detriment, to cause greater turmoil for him. The word of the Lord kept coming. It's like Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring the sword. Well, Jeremiah's words brought swords out against him. So the prophecy kept coming, verse 3 says, in the days of Jehoiakim until the 11th year of Zedekiah in the captivity that happened under Zedekiah. So we know that Jeremiah had a priestly lineage, that he was a Benjamite, that he began his career under Josiah, and it lasted all the way into the Babylonian exile. Slide 3, I just reminded you of what Judah would have looked like around this time. It would have been this orange section, maybe smaller than this, most likely somewhat smaller than this, although there was some expansion northward under Josiah probably. And in slide number 4, we see sort of Benjamin area. Now, the maps here are crisp and have well-defined borders, whereas, and this is an earlier map, a map of an earlier time, put it like that. Whereas in Jeremiah's day, the map would have been a lot fuzzier, and this all would have just been Judah. But, these tribal sort of affiliations would have carried over in traditional society like Jeremiah was used to. So Jeremiah was from the north. He was an outsider to Jerusalem. even though he was from a priestly family. And I think that's important to remember, that he's an outsider. He's not a Jerusalemite. He's from a different region of the country, and that probably had some role to play in how he viewed himself and especially how he was viewed. Now moving to slide 5, we see Jeremiah's kings. And this really sets up a good understanding for us of the background for Jeremiah and what he would have gone through, what he should have expected to go through. And it helps explain all the persecution that he faced. We see Manasseh reigned right before Jeremiah, and Jeremiah may have already been alive during the reign of Manasseh. In Josiah's 13th year, he's called to be a prophet. So he may have been born around the end of Manasseh's reign or the very beginning of Josiah's reign. Presumably, he's at least 12, 13, 14 years old. He could have been 18, 20, or maybe 25. He's a young man when he's called. He's looked at as boyish. So we don't know, how old would he have to be? A guy might look, especially with a beard, 22, 23, he might look a little older, but that's still considered relatively young if you're a public speaker. If you're making an impact on the nation's political outlook, 25 could still be a young man. But he could have been much younger because he says, I'm a lad. So he still could have been an 8th grader when he started prophesying. But we see after Josiah, Kings 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all bad. Some of these guys didn't reign long. Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, number 3 and number 5, both their reigns were cut fairly short. But 4 and 6, Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, each reigned around a decade or more. So Jeremiah's career would have started out very good with a supportive king in Josiah. And then after that, it would have been a lot of antagonism and friction between Jeremiah and the kings of his day. Okay, so because of that, what we see in the call of Jeremiah is a warning. I'm going to show you here first slide 6. Actually, slide 6 and 7 are already covered. So slide 6 and 7 just covers the reign of Josiah, how he was good. Slide 7 talks about Jehoiakim, how he was evil. And slide 9 shows you Slide 9 does something else. Anyway, so slide 7 and 8 just covers what I just covered. So slide 9 tells us some of the persecution that Jeremiah faced. So I wanted to walk you through some of the things that happened to Jeremiah. So we know he had bad kings most of his prophetic career. It started out with a good king, a supportive king, but that went away after, say a decade or so. He would have lost that kind of support. And then after that, he starts to face adversity from the ruling powers because his message is in conflict with their message and with their outlook. So if we start in slide 9, I want to show you a couple of things that happened to Jeremiah. So slide 9, we get Jeremiah beaten and put in stocks. So in chapter 20, it says, Now Pashur the priest, the son of Immer, who was chief officer in the house of the Lord. So this guy is like over the house of the Lord. He's not necessarily the priest, but he's the political appointee in that area to kind of monitor what happens. He heard what Jeremiah had just been prophesying in chapter 19. And we don't need to go back there, but Jeremiah typically is prophesying the need for repentance and this coming judgment. And also, part of Jeremiah's message is that they need to surrender to the Babylonians, or, and this was considered blasphemous, or the temple is going to be destroyed. Now, Jeremiah has something of a different message from other prophets in this respect. Isaiah, for instance, a century and a half before Jeremiah, had prophesied that the temple was going to stand, and that because the temple would stand because God was in it, and because God's in the temple, the city will stand. And he was very clear on this, and he prophesied to kings to try to get them to believe that the temple would stand, and not to go to other kingdoms for help, like to Assyria, like Ahaz did, the father of Hezekiah, or to Egypt, as Hezekiah was tempted to do, and it seems to have tried to do. Isaiah was like, just trust the temple, just trust the Lord. God is here with us. And he's given us his promise to stay with us. And he also preached the need for repentance. But his message was more on trusting in that promise. Whereas Jeremiah's message has shifted somewhat. By Jeremiah's day, the people, having seen this history of God delivering his people because of his presence there in Jerusalem, because of his presence in the temple, the people had begun to get smug. They apparently had begun to think that they could not fall, that the city was impregnable, that it could not be destroyed. They may have setbacks, but at the end of the day, if they put their faith in the promise to David, they put their faith in the promise of the temple, then they would stand. And Jeremiah's message is actually a departure from that because of the sin of the people, because of the way the temple had been defiled with the false gods that were there. We see this under Manasseh. We see this later on under the other kings, presumably. Jeremiah talks about the other idols that are brought into the temple, the way God is worshipped through offering up their offspring to Molech. This other idolatry that's there has rendered the temple so impure, so defiled, that God is ready to leave. Now that should ring a bell for you, having come through the book of Leviticus, to know that when God is in a place, if it's defiled, there's going to be some kind of reaction. Either God will have to leave or the people will be wiped out, or both. And the image we get in the book of Ezekiel is God leaving, and as God is leaving, he's destroying the people. So there's mass destruction because of the defilement of the temple, and God decides to leave his dwelling. Well, the book of Jeremiah kind of has that same message built into it. It's sort of implied throughout there. So Jeremiah preaches the destruction of the temple. He preaches the overthrow of the Davidic line. All these things that seem to be heresy, seem to go against on the surface reading of the book of Isaiah. But because of that, Jeremiah gets persecuted. So look what happens here. He preaches a message like that in the temple. And then it says, then Pashur beat Jeremiah. This is verse 2 on slide 9. Pashur beat Jeremiah the prophet and put him in the stocks that were in the upper Benjamin gate of the house of the Lord. Now this is very interesting because Jeremiah is beaten and then he's put in stocks. Now I've got a little image here on slide 10 of stocks just to remind you. Now we don't know on slide 10, we don't know if it looked exactly like this. It could simply have been chains, something that would have chained him up there. But the thing we need to remember about this kind of punishment, much like the cross, it's a form of shame, of public shaming. So it's one thing to put a person in prison. It's one thing to lock them away. It's another thing to lock them up in public, in front of other people. And so this is a way for the political leaders to show disapproval to Jeremiah. It's a way to warn everybody else, don't go this route or we will punish you too. This is public political disapproval. And Jeremiah is put in these stocks for a day. And notice where he's put back in verse 3 in slide 9, verse 2 in slide 9. It says he put him in stocks in the upper Benjamin gate of the house of the Lord. So there's this gate that comes in to the temple area, around the temple area. Jeremiah's put right there. Now, whether Jeremiah was put there because he's Benjamite or not, we don't know. But this was a thoroughfare. This was a heavily trafficked area to come in and out of the city and in and out of the temple. So Jeremiah is there. Hundreds, if not thousands of people would have seen the prophet locked up and publicly shamed. And presumably his enemies would have taken the chance at this time to mock him. And he's beaten before he's put there. And this beating probably is not it's not the kind of beating I would assume that would not have left a mark. Which means when Jeremiah is displayed, he's displayed as having been beaten. Presumably his garments would have been removed to show the stripes, to show the blood, to show the punishment. So this is a way of saying it's a warning. They're making a statement when they punish Jeremiah about Jeremiah's message and about anybody who identifies with Jeremiah's message. So that's one of the things that happens to Jeremiah. In slide 11, I'll show you one more thing that happens to Jeremiah. So in slide 11, it talks about how Jeremiah is cast into the cistern. Now, let me go down to slide 12 and just show you a cistern. So this is a cistern here in slide 12. Look at that. It's basically a pit. We've got another one in slide 13. If you want to look at that for just a moment. Slide 13 has another cistern. This one's much larger, and it's underground. You see a man standing in it. Now, these typically were reservoirs to catch rainwater, because rain comes in torrents, comes down very fast, very hard, and then you don't get rain again for weeks or sometimes months. So when you see these kind of areas, these hollowed out areas, they're to catch rainwater. Now, Jeremiah's put in one of these. Whether it looked like this, the one in slide 13 or the one in slide 12, we don't know. It would have been inside the city. But we know he was put in one. So look back at slide 11. Here in slide 11, it says, this is chapter 38 of Jeremiah, verse 3. Thus says the Lord, this is Jeremiah's message, this city shall surely be given into the hand of the army of the king of Babylon and be taken. So this is later in Jeremiah's career. This is a promise from Jeremiah that this land is going to be destroyed. Now you just imagine being in the city, trying to resist the Babylonians, and hearing a message like this. The king, the soldiers, the army, the leaders are all against the Babylonians. They've decided to take a stand against them. And here's this man in the city who is weakening the political will of the people to stand against the Babylonians. So look at verse 4. Then the officials said to the king, let this man be put to death, for he is weakening the hands of the soldiers who are left in the city, and the hands of all the people by speaking such words to them. For this man is not seeking the welfare of this people, but their harm. Now, I'll let you decide whether or not that's true, whether Jeremiah was seeking the welfare of his people or their harm. You can read the book of Jeremiah and see whether he cares for his people or not. Verse 5 says, King Zedekiah said, behold, he is in your hands, for the king can do nothing against you. So these officials, basically the king says, I'm not going to stand against you. This is very interesting how the book of Jeremiah is presenting Zedekiah here as weak. He says, I can't do anything against you. I'm the king. I can't resist you. When in fact, Jehoiakim, who had been king a little bit before, also resisted the Babylonians, was very strong-willed. And when his officials argued to listen to Jeremiah, Jehoiakim simply burned the scroll. Zedekiah is presented as very weak. And it's probably a deliberate slight here. It's probably a deliberate way of showing Zedekiah as weak-willed and not able to stand against his own servants. So verse 6 says, so they took Jeremiah, instead of killing him, or maybe this was a way of killing him, they took Jeremiah and cast him into the cistern of Malchiah, the king's son, which was in the court of the guard. So this is a court area where there's also an army garrison there. This is the guard area. So it's not just a cistern out at somebody's house. It's not definitely something out in the countryside. This is basically a prison in the area where the soldiers are housed and where they're quartered. So it says they let him down by ropes. So this presumably means this thing's very deep. And when he gets there, it says there was no water in the cistern, but only mud. And Jeremiah sank in the mud. So when it says he sinks down in the mud, I mean, we have to kind of think to ourselves, how deep was this? I mean, what does this look like when Jeremiah gets put in there? Is it like us when we step in mud and it kind of comes up our shoe a little bit? You know, if it's really bad for us, you know, it might go above our ankle. This sounds more like he's stuck, like he's put down in there, and this goes like knee deep or waist deep or somewhere else. That this is a miserable situation, and he's put in there. Remember, he's put in there not for like a period of time. This is not one of those things like, hey, we're going to put you in here for a week to punish you. This is, we want to kill him. The king says, okay, do what you want. Okay, the people who want to kill him do this to him. So presumably this is a way of throwing Jeremiah away. They expect him to die from this because he will dehydrate and starve. So they're not going to feed him. They're not going to water him. He's going to be in there. If they do get rain, he might drown. So whatever they think they're doing there, however long it takes, they think they're killing Jeremiah. they are intending to kill him. Now, as we know, it didn't work out. He was rescued. But again, this is another attempt at Jeremiah's life here. In slide 14, we get another example. This is under Jehoiakim. This is when Jeremiah's scroll was sent to the king, and the king cut it up and burned it. After that all happened, the Bible tells us this. The king cut up his scroll and burned it. Then this happened. Verse 26. And the king commanded Jerahmeel, the king's son, and Seraiah, the son of Azriel, and Shelemiah, the son of Abdiel, to seize Baruch the secretary, because remember he was the one who was writing down Jeremiah's scroll, and Jeremiah the prophet. So he was going to seize them, but the Lord hid them. So presumably, this is going to be an attempt on Jeremiah's life. This is where they're going to kill Jeremiah. What I'm showing you is Jeremiah had a series of bad kings he served under. He was hostile to their message, and they were hostile to him as a result. And he was beaten and publicly displayed. He was put into a cistern and expected to die there, but was secretly rescued. And then he's also sought after when he gives a message, and they're going to kill him. But God hid them. They went and hid themselves, and the Lord didn't let the people find him. So all of this kind of sets up for us to understand Jeremiah's situation here as perilous, as dangerous. There's a lot of violence against Jeremiah. There's a lot of threats of violence against Jeremiah. And in many ways, this sounds similar to what we see in the Apostle Paul's ministry, and it's very different from most of the prophetic personas that we read about in the Old Testament. I mean, we get Elijah, who gets threatened and runs away, but then he can show back up and prophesy. But most of our prophets don't face this kind of physical beating, imprisonment, death threats, and being sought after to be killed. So Jeremiah, in that respect, is very, very unique.